gentlemen, members of the government and members of the opposition, and Board of Adjudicators, please allow me to extend my greetings to everybody here today in this hall. I will be serving as your member of opposition today. Now, before I begin by addressing our motion, I would like to point out this sheet of references here for anyone who cares to check my facts later on. Now, before I begin by addressing today's motion, I would like to begin by sharing a quote with you, everyone here today. Jean-Paul Sartre once said that if a victory is told in detail, one can no longer distinguish it from a defeat. Ladies and gentlemen, with this concept in mind, allow me to proceed with refuting the government's motion by stating that this House does not believe that Egypt lost when it said it won in 1973. Ladies and gentlemen, what constitutes a victory? There are many wordings for what makes a victory, but ultimately it comes down to two things: performance and results. And these two things are what I will be discussing here today. One, the performance of the Egyptian military in the 1973 war, and two, the long-term results of that war. Now, let us look at number one. Let's talk about the performance of the Egyptian military in the 1973 war. I am not here to give you a lesson on a history that you already know. Most of us here today already know the basics. You don't want to hear me talk about how we timed our attack just right on Yom Kippur to overwhelm the enemy forces. You don't want to hear details about Egyptian engineers brought down the fabled Barlev line using only high-pressure water, after the Israeli government had boasted of how impenetrable it was. You don't want to hear me talk about the airstrike or how catastrophic it was for their forces. No. You're here today because you want to hear about the great controversy. You want to hear about the Defre-Swar gap, which the Prime Minister mentioned. Please go ahead.
If you're talking about performance, can't you just take the Israeli side for just 1 second? They were surprised and they gathered all their forces, and actually after 6 hours they were fully equipped and they marched towards the capital. Talk about performance.
I do believe you should do your research more closely. It was not after 6 hours. Thank you. Now, where was I? Yes, the Defre-Swar gap.
Information.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. You do acknowledge that after 6 hours they started to prepare, and after about a week they were that close to Cairo, and that was my Prime Minister's point, if you didn't get it well.
I find the government very redundant. I will be taking no more points of information from you. Again, the Defre-Swar gap. Ladies and gentlemen, I am sorry to disappoint you. All this hype about the Defre-Swar gap was just another exaggeration from the big Israeli propaganda machine. Yes, there was a gap in the defenses of the Egyptian Third Army, and yes, some enemy forces snuck in through it. But those were a few thousand soldiers. They were not the entire Israeli army. They were a veritable fly on the Egyptian Third Army's back. To claim that such a small number surrounded such a large army or posed a threat to a city as large as Cairo is arrant nonsense.
Points of information?
Let's talk about Cairo. Forget the Second Army stationed near there. Forget the Republican Guard. Let's even forget about the police force. Let's talk in terms of population alone. The population of the city alone would have torn the Israeli forces to pieces. We have a history of intense guerrilla resistance. Make us numerically superior as well. And what do you get? Complete and utter victory. this happened. But neutral parties state that Shazli basically wanted to turn a small part of the Third Army around and completely obliterate this small force of enemies behind our lines. While Sadat at the time was negotiating a ceasefire with the US that would allow the Israelis to save some face. Now, Shazli was a purely military man. He did not understand politics, and Sadat wasn't about to get into a political discussion with him in the middle of the war. Thus the removal. Now let us talk about number 2, the long-term results of the war. Ladies and gentlemen, we got our land back. Yes, the Camp David Treaty is not ideal, but let me share another quote with you. Victory comes at a price. Consider the variables. Against huge political and military pressure, we got every inch of our land back and every single enemy soldier out. And despite slow development in the Sinai region, there has been development there over the past 30 or 40 years. It's contributed quite a lot of revenue to the state treasury through our tourism industry as well as natural resources. Imagine if we had not fought that war. They would still have control of our land. Golda Meir is often credited with saying that Anwar Sadat is an Egyptian peasant who fooled them by giving them a piece of paper and taking all of our land back. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my thoughts